Welcome back, everyone, to the Quantum Connection podcast. I'm Heather Crimson, my co-host Vanessa Baldwin, and we have a legend here with us today. And I'm so excited to be with Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who has agreed to enlighten us about glyphosate and deuterium. So this is an extra special topic that is pretty new to the interwebs. And so just a little background on Dr. Seneff. She's a senior research scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She has degrees in biophysics and electrical engineering, and she has made a shift around 2007 in her research focus to exploring the whole realm of what causes disease and zeroing in on toxic substances. And she has a book, and it is called Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and Environment. And she's also now looking into the substance of deuterium, and she's going to bring us up to date on all of the things that are really critical to know about your health around deuterium. So welcome so much, Dr. Seneff, to the show.
So great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, you're welcome. Start us off, Vanessa.
Yeah, we're so glad you're here. I really want to know, like, what got you into studying glyphosate and deuterium and making this connection? Like, how did you even begin to understand that toxins in our environment are really causing damage to us, and what made you go down this rabbit hole that it is?
Yeah, well, it's partly actually that the work I was doing was becoming obsolete. So I was motivated to find something else to do because I was developing conversational interfaces with computers, teaching computers to communicate with humans using natural speech. And we were really pioneers in that space. We developed systems, spoken dialogue systems, earlier than just about anybody else, way back in the 1980s, late 1980s, 1990s. So it was really exciting to see that technology, come to fruition and actually become commercially viable. But that's when the companies just took over and they hired massive numbers of people to develop these systems, and we couldn't really compete anymore in the work I was doing. And so I was a little bit lost as far as how am I going to finish out my career. And at the same time, I was watching the autism rates go up every year. Every year there's more. We're just diagnosing it more. Don't worry about it. It's not a problem. And I was like, no, I don't think so, because I didn't know anybody with autism the whole time I was growing up. I didn't even know the word,
Wow. Wow.
So it was something fishy going on. And I thought there's got to be something in the environment that's causing this. It can't be, they're talking genetics. They're doing all the funding is going towards genetics, and they're finding this and that, lots and lots of, mutations that are associated with small amounts of the cases. It's like, each mutation accounts for 1 or 2% of the cases. It's just like, tons of different genes are involved, but you can't really figure out, the story. And I said, it can't be the genes. The genes are there. They're causing some kids to be more susceptible than others, but there's a poison. There's got to be. And of course, there's so many poisons. It's easy to imagine that one or more of them might be causing autism. And in fact, I think it's the case. It's synergistic toxicity among a lot of different things. But I kind of felt like there's got to be something else that's going up dramatically in step with the rise in rise in autism, and I need to find that. And and I looked for 5 years, and I was looking at different things, and I wasn't really coming up with anything. So 2007 to 2012 timeframe, I knew a lot about autism by that point because I was furiously reading literature on autism, and I know it's an extremely complex condition with many comorbidities, gut problems and mineral deficiencies and methylation pathway disabled, lots and lots of things. And so 2012, I happened to be at a conference. Professor Don Huber, I didn't know who he was, but he was giving a talk. It was on this thing called glyphosate. I didn't know what it was. I was like, well, I should listen to this. This is a poison, an herbicide. Let me see what he has to say. And I was completely blown away. He talked for 2 hours, and he covered all these things that fit so well with what I knew about autism. It was so amazing. I was just on the edge of my seat, and I was like, this is it. This has got to be it. And I had sort of, I knew about glyphosate. I knew about Roundup. I never used it because I don't like to use poisons. I had no idea that it was all over the food supply. I wasn't really aware that they were using it so extensively in agriculture. By far the most used herbicide in the world. And the US uses more than any other country per person. And so, and we know it's all over the food because people like Zen Honeycutt have been looking at the processed foods, the school lunches, and finding 95, 100% of the samples are coming up positive for glyphosate. So I think it's the most pervasive poison that our kids are exposed to, especially they eat a lot of processed foods. They eat school lunch, they're not being protected from this poison. And so anyway, I got really interested in reading about glyphosate. I came back from that conference and started reading everything I could find on glyphosate. And the more I read, the more I was convinced that I was right. So I just took off on that, and I haven't turned back. I mean, I've been on to glyphosate since then. And of course, this book, which I have right here, Toxic, this was the concept, after 10 years really of research, I came out with this book, and it's a fascinating molecule and has really, really interesting effects in biology that are really complicated and that fit like hand in glove with the autism. All the issues with autism fit perfectly with glyphosate. So I'm absolutely convinced that it's the primary cause of the epidemic. It's not the only thing that causes autism.
So can I ask, Dr. Seneff, so there must be something about what the glyphosate molecule does in the shikimate, is that the right word, shikimate pathway, that leads to symptoms that show up as autism. Is that right?
Yeah, shikimate pathway is a major part of the story, but there's also other things as well that I go into in my book. There's much else besides the shikimate path that goes on. It's a very fascinating molecule with a unique, insidious, cumulative mechanism of toxicity that nothing else has. So very, very unique, and it's a slow kill. So you don't notice, you don't get horribly sick, you don't throw up, if you're exposed to it, you kind of handle it, but you gradually accumulate it all over your tissues. It accumulates in your tissues. And it does really nasty things because I believe it's getting into proteins by mistake in place of the amino acid glycine. And that's kind of the centerpiece of my book. I've been saying this for some time now, and the industry denies that it's possible. I say it has to be happening because it makes so much sense to explain all the different things that we see in association with glyphosate. You can explain what it does by this mechanism of substituting, and particularly what it does in the shikimate pathway. And I talk about that in my book. It's really perfect. And I think the Monsanto researchers knew it because there's a paper that Anthony Samsel got through the FOIA request. He got this, it wasn't published, but it was an unpublished study done by some folks back in the 1980s, where they looked at bluegill sunfish and they exposed them to radio-labeled glyphosate so they could track the radio label. They were interested in the question of whether glyphosate gets into the tissues. And so they got the tissue samples. Indeed, there was radio labeled in the tissues. And then they said, well, let's measure for glyphosate using the normal methods. And they came up short, like only 20% of the radio label could be accounted for as glyphosate. So either glyphosate had turned into something else. It was capturing the molecule, the atom that was labeled, or maybe glyphosate was there, but hidden in some way that you couldn't actually see it. So they said, well, why don't we add some enzymes, and some hydrochloric acid that will break down the protein into individual amino acids and try again. So they did that, and then they got 80% yield. So the glyphosate was hiding in the proteins. Oh. And they said perhaps it was incorporated into the protein. This was their words, which is exactly what I'm saying. It's incorporated into the protein. And the reason why is because it's a glycine analog.
Right. So the body doesn't know the difference between glycine and glyphosate. This makes me think of Ehlers-Danlos and all these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's tons of glycine in collagen. I'm glad you bring that up. And I talked about that in my book. There's tons of glycine. It's GXY. Every third amino acid is a glycine. And it needs that in order to build this beautiful triple helix structure that it makes. It forms into this beautiful helix, and that gives it its special properties of tensile strength and ability to absorb water, flexibility. Collagen is the most common protein in your body. A third of your proteins are collagen, and it makes up your joints and your bones and your tissues. It's just everywhere. The fascia, it's just everywhere. And so when you start throwing bullets at the collagen, you mess up that triple helix. You can have Ehlers-Danlos from a single glycine mutation in collagen. Many different single glycine mutations in collagen cause these genetic diseases that are now, Ehlers-Danlos is going up in prevalence. Right. It's a genetic disease. So why is it going up? Well, that's because glyphosate is able to effectively make a genetic mutation. It does it molecule by molecule. So it's not like the gene is incorrect. It's just that when it makes the protein, it messes up.
Right. So just so people to understand, I want to clarify that instead of glycine being in a spot that it's supposed to be, glycine, now glyphosate is there instead, right? And this is what's causing that damage. So Yeah, it's so interesting to read that. And you saw that, and like I said, I'm not, I don't have a lot of biochemistry knowledge, but I see that in, a book clearly, it's supposed to be glycine, but instead it's glyphosate. Instead it's glyphosate. And, that's not good. That's not what we want there. We don't want a toxin where we're supposed to have glycine,
Yeah,
so
and certain proteins. So you do a lot of, rummaging around the literature looking for mutations in proteins. One of the things I do is to find glycine mutations that cause severe disease. And so a particular protein, glycine mutation, major disease, then I see whether that disease is going up, going up over time. And then, aha, glyphosate's doing that, that's what I think. And there's a
yeah.
lot of them. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, that's insane. And I'm glad you brought that up because it's just, it shows that, we're definitely seeing a rise in that as well as autism. And it was really interesting to see the autism connection there in the book. And going back to the shikimate pathway, that disrupts our ability to use our aromatic amino acids, which I also found to be really, really interesting as well, because we talk a lot about that on our podcast about how, you need to have tryptophan to serotonin to melatonin to get your rest and repair and rejuvenation and so on. And, dopamine and all of that, you need to have tyrosine to dopamine, and all of those pathways need to be working appropriately. So if you have glyphosate, I'm assuming like in your gut or where it doesn't belong, it's going to disrupt that process. So maybe talk just a little bit about that, because it's disrupting the aromatic amino acids, which then is disrupting our neurotransmitters, which is, this is not good. Like we need,
Yes.
we don't have good melatonin and serotonin and dopamine. We're not going to be healthy. So
you are absolutely right. And I really zeroed in on that with the autism, because, and you see tons and tons of papers around autism having disturbances in all these pathways related to these neurotransmitters, and melatonin as well. There's lots of papers on melatonin is sort of supplementing melatonin to help the autistic kids sleep because they have sleep disorder. And actually, there's a brand new paper on glyphosate that showed that specifically that glyphosate suppresses melatonin synthesis. And I think that is absolutely huge because melatonin is incredibly important. And we can get back to it when we start talking about deuterium because it ties into the deuterium story. But yes, and it's also thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone comes out of that pathway too. And of course, the gut. Yes. They say, well, plants, this is an enzyme in plants. This EPSP synthase is a specific enzyme in the shikimate pathway that glyphosate famously disrupts. It disrupts it by substituting for a glycine residue at a place where the enzyme binds phosphate. And if you change that glycine residue to alanine, you make a mutation in the protein and make alanine instead, it's completely insensitive to glyphosate. And there's a paper on that by Dow Chemical, a paper that shows that if you mutate that, and they can do these mutations now in the laboratory, the plant is completely insensitive to glyphosate. So this is the basis for the Roundup Ready crops that are resistant to glyphosate. They found an enzyme that was one of these, the same enzyme that in the shikimate pathway that they need. They found a version of it in some microbes that were able to survive exposure to glyphosate. And they figured out that enzyme, they could give that enzyme to the plants through genetic engineering, which is what they did to make those Roundup Ready crops.
But changes glycine to alanine, you're saying the amino acid alanine, and that makes it immune to, or then the glyphosate doesn't?
It doesn't match because it's the code that it's matching. It's the code for glycine, and alanine has a different code. So once you change the code, it's protected. It's completely protected from glyphosate. And this was a very strong indicator to me, that plus the bluegill sunfish story. And I write about that all in one chapter in my book, where I kind of make a case for this argument. And it substitutes for glycine only if there's enough room for the extra methylphosphonate that's attached to its nitrogen atom. So in some proteins where glycine has bulky amino acids on both sides, it's probably not going to substitute. It needs room. And it has this extra stuff that needs to go somewhere. So where it finds good room is at a place where glycine binds. Glycine is in the sequence and is essential for the sequence to be able to bond phosphate. And that is critical. So I found several enzymes, and I'm sure there are a bunch more that I haven't found yet, that have that property. They have a highly conserved glycine, sometimes 3 highly conserved glycines at a site where they bind phosphate. And that is the property of EPSP synthase as well. It binds PEP, phosphoenolpyruvate, at a place where it has a highly conserved glycine, and that's where you can substitute the alanine to keep glyphosate from harming it. And so it's a very clear story in my view, and it annoys me that the mainstream chemists are pushing back and saying no, it can't happen. But there's actually several examples of toxins that work by substituting for proteins. for amino acids in proteins. That's a pattern that is seen for many other very toxic molecules. And so it's not like that doesn't happen, but I don't know of any that have substituted for glycine besides glyphosate.
I love that you brought up the thyroid, because it's definitely an endocrine disruptor as well. So that tyrosine pathway also we need for thyroid hormone. And in your book, you really had like, I mean, it's affecting us on so many different diseases, not only autism, but autoimmunity, endocrine disorders, fertility, you know, autism, which is neurological, but like so many. And then it also affects the gut, which I thought was interesting because it acts like an antibiotic on the gut. So I wanted to bring that in as well, which also I found interesting. This was in a podcast I listened to about the deuterium. We're bringing that in, is that deuterium is low level in breast milk, but glyphosate also, and maybe you can help me make that connection, disrupts a lot of different bacteria, and it works like an antibiotic in the gut in children. So this process can happen. This disruption can happen very early on. So maybe talk a little bit about that. And if you want to bring in the deuterium there a little bit, that would be cool.
Yeah, it might work here, but you're right. The gut microbes, of course, many of them have that enzyme, the enzyme that glyphosate disrupts. And that's why it's a false argument to say, oh, we don't have that enzyme and therefore we're fine, because we depend enormously on our gut microbes for our health. And, you know, it's really in the past decade, there's been a huge increase in the number of papers talking about the gut microbiome. And it's partly because we're noticing that it's not working the way it should be.
Right.
But for the longest time, it was doing fine. And we didn't realize all the things that those gut microbes are doing for the host. You know, they are really, really important. In a way, I think of us as kind of a nest for them. Our purpose in life is to be a nest where they can live comfortably in our gut, you know, and it's a symbiotic relationship. They provide us with all kinds of nutrients. And we in return give them a nice safe place to live, you know. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So they're God, really. And of course the gut also is like the second brain. It has a lot of neurons, and it actually behaves more like a brain than the other parts of the body. So quite interesting. And there's a lot of communication between the gut microbes and the brain, you know, that's going on. That's monitoring the health of the body and the brain. Then the microbes tell the brain messages, and then the brain reacts by changing metabolic policy. So it's really, really fascinating, the interaction between the gut microbes and the brain. But the microbes are being killed by glyphosate, and preferentially the beneficial microbes, lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, are really important in the infant gut. And I have a whole chapter on the gut in my book, which was a very difficult chapter to write. I can remember really poring over the literature to try to get the story for that chapter. And I was finally quite pleased with how it came out. It's so many ways that things are getting disrupted, but it starts with messing up lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Lactobacillus help the host to digest milk. And lots of kids have issues with milk, and then they end up being put on a soybean, soy formula. And the soy formula is horrendous. If you look at the ingredients in soy formula, it's just a bunch of chemicals.
So bad.
It's so bad. Of course, soy is a GMO Roundup ready, crop. So you're going to have glyphosate in there. Oh. And there's glyphosate in breast milk as well. Zen Honeycutt of Moms Across America, who's a friend of mine, she actually had several moms donate breast milk, and she had it tested for glyphosate. And a third of the samples came out positive, despite the fact that most of the moms were conscientious about eating. So it's pretty amazing. So the glyphosate's in both the breast milk and the soy formula, but probably consistently higher in the soy formula. But anyway, so they can't digest milk. And that's because the lactobacillus provide enzymes that are specifically focused on breaking proline apart from its neighbors. Proline is a really, really interesting amino acid that's found in high levels in milk. And so we depend upon them to help us break it apart. We don't have those enzymes that can break the proline amino acid apart from its neighbors. So you get these segments of milk, peptide sequences from milk that don't get digested. They stick around. And that means you don't get those amino acids as food either that are in those peptides, because you have to absorb the amino acids in the midgut. That's where they absorb it, and then you can use them to make your own proteins. But that doesn't happen because these peptides are sticking around. The peptides get into the colon, and in the colon, there are other microbes that can finally break them apart, and not only break them apart, but completely break them down into nitrogen. And, they break apart the nitrogen that's in the amino acids, and that nitrogen is very basic, so it raises the pH of the gut. And so you get an elevated pH in the colon, which disrupts the microbes that make butyrate. So butyrate is an essential nutrient for the colonocytes, the cells that line the colon. They depend upon butyrate to be healthy. And the microbes that make the butyrate depend upon a low pH. And so all that nitrogen that comes in because those peptides didn't get digested ends up messing up the pH, ends up making those guys die off, and now you don't have enough butyrate. So it's really interesting how everything just tumbles,
Eat some more butter, some grass
Oh, I
fed
know.
butter.
Butter is fantastic, and it's also a low deuterium nutrient.
Yeah, low deuterium and high in butyrate as
Butyrate.
well. So yeah, so
That's
get
why I
that.
pay a good chunk of money for my raw butter.
Yeah, me too.
I love butter too. I eat lots of butter, so that's a beautiful fat, and
But
it's
it
got a
sounds
lot
like,
of nutrition.
Dr. Seneff, when that pH is disrupted in the colon, then I'm guessing sets the stage for disease there.
Yeah, so you get irritable bowel disease, inflammatory bowel disease. So inflammatory bowel disease is going up exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate. That's one of the things we looked at, perfect match. And that's, that's both colitis, I guess, and IBD. There's two different forms of it, but they're really nasty, and it's an epidemic. So
yeah, we have a lot of epidemics going on right now. So yeah, so now it's destroying the gut microbiome, at such a young age. My own son was on soy formula. This is before I knew any of these things. Dr.
I
Seneff
know,
would
it's
never
hard.
have done that if I would have known, but he was lactose intolerant to my breast milk, probably because I was eating glyphosate foods. I didn't know these things. I mean, I've been on a health journey, so I'm learning. So if you're a listener and you don't know these things, don't feel guilty. Now you know, now we can make better choices, right? So so that's really great to know, though. Now let's go into the deuterium. So let's talk a little bit about
it's a good time to do that.
Yeah, my knowledge on deuterium is that it's a very heavy, dense hydrogen. It kind of jams up the ATPase. Maybe you have a better way of explaining it, but one of my trainers had taught me, not Dr. Carrie, she should be a doctor really though, right? Another like Carrie Bennett, she had taught us that it's like trying to jam two basketballs into one hoop, and everything gets jammed up, and then the electrons or protons or whatever can't spin the way they're properly supposed to do. So you probably can explain it a little bit better than that, but let's get into it.
That's perfect, actually. And that's the critical thing. Deuterium messes up the ATPase pumps. That's the critical thing that then causes biology to do to jump through a lot of hoops to fix that problem. And so deuterium is heavy hydrogen. So it's like you've heard of carbon-14. There's carbon-12 is a normal carbon, and then there's carbon-14. So there's the different isotopes of carbon, and then there's also different isotopes of hydrogen. Hydrogen is the tiniest atom in the world. It only has one proton and one electron. And of course, it's by far the most common atom in our body. I mean, it's most of our atoms are hydrogen atoms. I don't know. I think it might even be like over 90% of our atoms are hydrogen because they're so tiny, But certainly like 70% by weight of our mass is hydrogen. It's just a huge, huge contribution to our, and of course, it's essential for all these reactions that take place with the enzymes, through the help of these enzymes. There's redox reactions. Hydrogen is always involved. And of course, hydrogen is in water, H2O, right? 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen, that's water. And water is by far the biggest molecule in our bodies. We're like 70% water. So it's really mind-boggling to think about that. So deuterium is heavy hydrogen, and it has an extra neutron. It has the proton, and then it has a neutron, and then it has an electron. And the neutron is about as heavy as a proton, so it's twice as heavy. So it is like 2 basketballs instead of 1, twice as heavy. And that makes it bind more tightly wherever it's bound to something, and also makes it weaker with the ionic bonds, where there's 2 molecules that have these ionic bonds that are attracting, holding them together, as opposed to covalent bonds, where it's actually physically attached with electrons circulating around both of them. I don't know how much chemistry you know, but that's anyway, okay. The ionic bonds are weaker and the covalent bonds are stronger with deuterium, which makes lots of things very different. The enzymes behave differently when there's deuterium, where hydrogen would normally be. And there's a lot of enzymes that have figured out how to do their reaction much better if it's hydrogen. So they want to take a hydrogen off of this molecule and put it over here. And and they'll see, oh gosh, that's deuterium, I don't want that. It can actually say, I won't take it from that molecule because it's deuterium, just throw it away and go get another one. It can do that. And it does that through some very interesting physics, which is called hydrogen tunneling. Oh, yeah. They have very sophisticated hydrogen tunneling capabilities with the way that the enzyme is designed to pull that hydrogen through this sort of tunnel. And the deuterium is too big and bulky, it can't get into the tunnel. So it causes the enzyme to be very capable of choosing hydrogen over deuterium. And some of them have what they call a deuterium kinetic isotope effect of like 100 times as likely to choose a hydrogen versus a deuterium. Wow. Very, very effective at making sure it doesn't put deuterium on the product. And then that product is typically something the body really cares about. So that's what becomes very interesting. So I want to get back to the hydrogen as a gas, because this is where I really feel this is so significant and so interesting with the gut microbes. The gut microbes, some of the microbes can make hydrogen gas. Mm-hmm. And they do that by taking hydrogen atoms off of molecules like glucose. So they have a sugar molecule, they yank off the hydrogen, they get a couple of hydrogens and put them together, make gas. And the hydrogen gas gets released as a gas. And then there's other molecules, not molecules, microbes that can take the hydrogen gas and combine it with carbon dioxide and make methane gas. So now you've got methane gas, right? And then the methane gas, there's other microbes that can take the methane gas and turn it back into something that's not gas by adding some oxygens to it. And so you get, from the methane gas, you get methanol, you get formaldehyde, you get formate, and eventually come back around to carbon dioxide. And there's a whole cycle that the gut microbes do, where they take the carbon dioxide and the hydrogen, they make the methane, they send it around this cycle, and then carbon dioxide comes back out. So it seems like a kind of a useless cycle, but what's happening is those hydrogens are being grabbed by being attached to the methane, and then they're being spun off, and they're being stuck onto NAD, and they're making NADH.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
So nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, right? And you probably know about that if you know about redox reactions. It's all over the place in redox reactions. And it goes from NAD plus to NADH. And that H is golden. If it came from those gut microbes, it's going to be extremely low. The hydrogen gas that's made is 80% reduced in deuterium. 80%. And partly that's due to the enzyme, and partly that's due to the fact that deuterium likes to hang out in the liquid phase. It doesn't want to go into the gas. So 80% reduction starting off with that hydrogen gas. And now the body pays attention to those hydrogen atoms, very close attention. And it puts them onto NADH, and it also puts them onto methionine. Methionine is a universal methyl donor. So it takes the methane and it becomes methyl, and it gets attached to the sulfur in methionine. And then you've got golden methyls that are 80% depleted in deuterium. And now the body passes those methyls all over the place, methylation pathways, DNA methylation, histone methylation, just lots and lots of methyls are stuck in all kinds of places. And the body treasures them because they're so low in deuterium. And this is something people do not realize. I don't know of anybody who said this besides myself.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. Yeah.
So too much deuterium is going to muck up all that pathway, you're saying.
Yeah, and so now what really gets interesting is you look at supplements like S-adenosyl methionine, right? That's a big popular supplement, and also melatonin, right?
So what's the one you just mentioned? That's not SOD. It's
SAMe.
Okay.
Yes, I want to ask about that, because I hear a lot of the times that when we take too many supplements, or we take a lot of synthetic supplements, it actually adds to our deuterium load.
There you go. You are absolutely right.
Yeah, and it's actually causing a problem. So like, when I remember when I first got, you don't know my health history, but I got pretty sick. And I was taking like a ton of supplements, and I don't think I felt any better. In fact, I think I felt worse. And I'm like, well, now I look back, I'm like, well, maybe it was that deuterium in all those supplements. Like it's not, that's not where our health should come from. Our health should come from nutrient dense foods that are free of toxins, right? But yeah, sometimes when we're taking all these supplements, it seems like, they contain a lot of deuterium, then can cause a lot of more issues in the body than alleviation or help, right?
Absolutely the case. And this is what I had an epiphany, because I had been reading long before I knew about deuterium. I had come across some literature. I don't know if you know about this, but like they were saying methionine deficiency will lengthen life. Have you heard of that? Methionine deficiency lengthens life. So they discovered this with rats. They did experiments with rats, and they have all these, they don't feed the rats natural proteins for these experiments because they want to have complete control over how much of which amino acid they get. So they get all these amino acids from the lab, from the chemistry lab, and then they feed them and they give them an appropriate, combination of amino acids compared to what you would expect them to need from nutrition. And then the control group gets the normal amount of methionine, and then the treatment groups gets less, maybe half as much, I don't know, but less methionine. And then they follow the rats and see how well they do. And they find out that the guys that got less methionine lived longer. So they say, well, methionine, so they talk about starvation being a way to increase life. There's these people who are hung up on not eating. Fasting. And then methionine deficiency increases lifespan. And that just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because methionine is so essential for so many things. It's a source of sulfate and it's a source of methyl groups, both of them. So it doesn't make any sense that methionine deficiency would be useful. And when I first read that, I was like, this is wacky. I don't understand this at all. This doesn't make any sense. And I just set it aside, And then when I started reading about deuterium, I was like, oh my God, it was an epiphany for me. Because all of these supplements that you're taking of amino acids are made in the chemistry lab. It's too much trouble. Imagine trying to harvest, grow some E. coli and then purify and get rid of all the other stuff that's there and just make pure methionine out of that. That would be impossibly difficult. So all of them are coming from supplements that are coming from probably petroleum, Yeah,
that's what I've heard, Dr. Seneff. So I really appreciate you saying that, because people look at me like I'm crazy when I say that.
Petroleum is the source of these in the chemistry lab, and you make these supplements, and there's no question that they don't have 80% reduction in deuterium. And that is the whole reason why methionine is so important, because of that 80% reduction. Your body doesn't realize that it doesn't have it, And so it goes ahead and tries to save it and everything, and it's just garbage. It's saving garbage.
So say it again, because I lost you there. So it's not that methionine deficiency lengthens lifespan. It's about the deuterium.
Yes.
Go that again.
So, but the thing is, when the rats are not getting enough methionine in their diet, they have to make it themselves. And when they make it themselves, they make beautiful methionine that's depleted in deuterium. But if they've got plenty of dietary methionine, they get lazy. They don't make it. They don't need it. They use what they got from their diet, and it's garbage.
So they gotta strengthen it. It's like we have to strengthen it ourselves instead of trying to, jam everything up by putting synthetic things into our body. Like we have to do it ourselves. Right? That makes sense.
I would never take aminos. They have when you go to the drugstore now, and the health food store, just aisles and aisles of all these different amino combinations. It shows you that people are deficient in amino acids, and they're deficient because glyphosate is preventing them from digesting their proteins.
Right, exactly.
Does this have anything to do with peptide therapy, or is that somewhere I shouldn't ask you about that?
I don't know about peptide therapy.
Okay.
Oh yeah, peptides can be, it's taking amino acids. Some of them though, like there are different ones, because I researched it some time, and I've tried them on myself, in the past. Sometimes they're like bioregulators, so they don't have any other synthetic property. Like it's almost like eating liver, or you're eating the peptide of, it's a 3 amino acids, and you're eating the
I see.
You're eating
it's
the
like
peptide
tripeptides.
Like an animal product, right?
Yeah.
So,
so that's more natural. So collagen, for example, a lot of people take collagen,
right?
And glycine. There's a lot of glycine in collagen. So if you're taking something that's derived from collagen, then that's natural, and that's going to have good stuff in it. So but of course it's going to have glyphosate in it too. If the collagen came from something that's eating glyphosate, it's going to be a really good source of glyphosate. So you don't win, you either get it from the chemistry lab where it doesn't have the proper deuterium mixture, or you get it from the animal, in which case you're eating glyphosate. So I won't eat any supplements of that sort, any kind of amino acids. I've never had amino acid supplements of any sort.
So the SAMe, tell me again about the SAMe.
That's S-adenosyl methionine.
Yeah.
So that's methionine at the base, and it's got an adenosine attached to it. And of course, there's also N-acetylcysteine. A lot of people take that, and autistic kids, that's a really good supplement for them. And people have found benefit. N-acetylcysteine. Cysteine is a very close cousin of methionine, and each of them can be made from the other one. And it's just basically adding that methyl or not. So cysteine doesn't have the methyl. So when you take the cysteine, your body has to come up with a methyl to stick to it to make methionine. So that's much, much better. It's much better to take cysteine than to take methionine, because that methyl group is going to be produced by the body, and you hope that it's going to come from some natural source.
Right. And then that's going to promote the body to make more glutathione, which is a major antioxidant, which helps with all that. I love the sulfation stuff. Like I said, I'm definitely not scientific, but it was interesting to read about all the sulfation, and it made me think of sunlight and vitamin D, and how, people take vitamin D versus going in the sunlight. Right. And we talk a lot about the benefits of sunlight here on our podcast. And it's like, if you get a vitamin D from a pill, opposed to getting the vitamin D from the sunlight, where your body has to take the cholesterol and sulfate. When it sulfates all the proteins and then it, moves through the body. It's a totally different animal than, taking it in a pill form. It's literally not even the same thing. So it's like, that made me think of that connection with the sunlight. Like we need to not interfere with nature, and just let nature do its thing, just eat the animal protein and fat and get out in the sun and make our cholesterol. So, have the cholesterol, make the sulfated proteins of vitamin D or whatever you want to call it, or move throughout our body the way it's supposed to be. You probably can say it in a better way, but yeah. I mean,
no, that's great. You read the book carefully. Yes, it's so interesting because both the sulfation pathways and the methylation pathways are severely disrupted in autism, both of them. It's very clear. And they both come from methionine. That's what's so interesting. And glyphosate suppresses methionine synthesis in plants and in microbes. That's been shown experimentally. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't surprise me because the enzymes that you need to make the methionine depend upon this glycine situation with the binding phosphate at highly conserved glycines. So it's being messed up. The multiple enzymes involved in the sulfation pathways are being suppressed by glyphosate. Because of this coming into the protein in place of glycine at places where it binds phosphate. And what it's binding is ATP. So ATP is triphosphate, right? So there's anything that binds ATP, almost always, in fact, there's a whole a motif at the ATP binding site. And I talk about that in my book. That's like a GXXGXXG motif. 3 glycines, and the other ones are wild cards.
Okay.
So glyphosate can substitute for any of those 3 glycines and mess it up.
Wow. And
so any enzyme that binds ATP is probably being messed up by glyphosate. And all these enzymes that are involved with sulfate, there's an enzyme, absolutely interesting enzyme that makes something called PAPS, phosphoadenosyl phosphosulfate. And notice those 2 phosphos, right? That's phosphate. Dangerous, very dangerous. And that enzyme actually binds to 2 ATP molecules, the enzyme that makes the PAPS synthase. It starts with a sulfate, and then it makes basically a sulfate on steroids because the PAPS is energized by virtue of having those 2 phosphates attached to it. It's actually, 2 phosphates and a sulfate, I think, is in the PAPS. Phosphoadenosyl phosphosulfate, 2 phosphates and a sulfate. And so the sulfate has this carrier molecule, the PAPS, that energizes it so that you can stick it onto things. And that's the universal sulfate donor, PAPS. And the enzyme that makes it, binds these ATP molecules at places where it has highly conserved glycines. It gets wrecked by glyphosate. So you can't make this energized sulfate, and then you can't sulfate things. And so all of your, and of course, not only can you not make serotonin because it comes out of the shikimate pathway, but you also can't stick the sulfate onto it. Normally, most of the serotonin in your body is made in the gut, and then it's attached to sulfate, and then it's shipped out and it goes to the brain. And it's delivering sulfate to the brain on top of serotonin. And so all of that gets messed up when glyphosate's poisoning all those enzymes. It's just a disaster. And so the kids have deficiency in serotonin, which directly translates into deficiency in melatonin because it comes from serotonin. Yep. Melatonin deficiency, I think, is a core feature of autism.
Oh yeah, 100%. I agreed with that. Yeah, because that controls, our autophagy, apoptosis, cell death. Like we need to have all of that going on. So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. So
but also, and I hear all the things you're saying. It's like, of course, we have anxiety and a depression epidemic, and now the severe mental illnesses are increasing, bipolar, whatever. It's because of all these disturbances of all the pathways and the raw materials the body's using. So you have the issues with the sulfation and whatnot, and because of the glyphosate messing up the ATPase, and then the deuterium is also contributing to that. So
absolutely. And so actually, I told you about this cycle that goes from the methane. So you get the methane, it's got those beautiful hydrogens. It's CH4, 4 golden hydrogens that came from hydrogen gas. And the methane goes through the cycle. Methanol, formaldehyde, formate, comes back to carbon dioxide. It's a cycle, and it pulls off these H's and sticks them onto NADH. And those are called, the enzymes that do that are called dehydrogenases. Oh, and glyphosate was shown to suppress a dozen different dehydrogenases in E. coli in a study that I found. I think all the dehydrogenases are being suppressed, and they have this characteristic feature that you need to be susceptible to glyphosate.
Interesting. Yeah.
So that pathway is not working, and now the gases pile up, the methane piles up, and now the cows are releasing lots of methane. They're causing global climate change. You got to kill the cows, right? Well, don't kill the cows. Give them an organic diet.
Yeah, stop feeding them glyphosate. Exactly.
Yeah,
Stop feeding the
feeding
cows
them.
glyphosate, and then you won't have the problem with that issue. Yeah,
That's right.
we don't ever think of that way, like to go backwards, like they want to
Well,
just
we never seem to think that it could be some kind of disruption by toxic exposures. I don't know why, it really frustrates me. And these papers that'll compare two different fats and they'll have, this one and that one, and they have no clue about how much glyphosate is in either one of them. And then they'll find that one of them is better than the other one. And I'm guessing it's because it has less glyphosate. Like, it doesn't even matter what the fat is, just whether it has glyphosate or not is the big story,
Yeah.
Except, isn't it interesting that they don't use glyphosate in Europe?
They do use it, but they don't. They're very
I thought
strict.
it was banned.
No, I wish. They just renewed it for 10 years, actually. There was a big battle, and I contributed funds to that, trying to stop it. There were a lot of protests, but then, of course, Bayer put out this lovely brochure that said glyphosate is wonderful, and we can't live without it. So they said, okay, fine.
You know how you hear about so many people go to Europe and they can eat wheat without a problem, and then they come back here? What's your sense? What sense do you make of that?
Yeah, that is interesting. And I think it might actually have something to do with the what's in the meat that are added as supplements to it's fortified, right? Here we require by law to fortify the meat with iron and folic acid. And it's the wrong kind of iron, it's the wrong kind of folic acid. So it makes the wheat toxic. Totally. I've given presentations on this topic.
Okay.
But there's also glyphosate, and we also have a lot more glyphosate than they do in our wheat because we're more friendly towards glyphosate. We love glyphosate in this country. We think it's awesome.
Oh my God. That's really interesting too, because I hear a lot of people say you're not gluten intolerant, you're actually glyphosate intolerant, which actually, seems like it could be plausible, actually.
Absolutely. And I wrote a paper on that. Now, linking, in fact, we looked at the correlation. I've done a lot of correlation studies with patterns over time of diseases. You can get a lot of information off the web. Actually, it's freely available from the government of, just the rates of different things. And when you look at gluten, you look at celiac disease over time, and you align that with glyphosate usage on wheat, and you can see very strong correlation. And it's a better match than glyphosate usage on corn or soy. So it makes sense because the wheat's being poisoned. The wheat is sprayed right before harvest with glyphosate. It's not a GMO food. So people think, oh, non-GMO, that's wonderful, I'll buy it. No, it can be even higher levels in the non-GMO foods that are sprayed right before harvest, because that's going to get in. The other ones are sprayed earlier. So this right before harvest means it's going to stick around. It goes into the seed. The wheat germ has more than, so the healthy parts of the wheat have more glyphosate.
Yeah.
Because it absorbs it more easily, I'm guessing.
It goes into the seed, actually. It goes into the seed. Don Huber talked about that.
I wanted to ask you too, because like some people will say, oh yeah, I just avoid the dirty dozen. And I'm like, well, I think we need to have a little bit of a conversation, because just because you peel the banana off, the peel will come off, doesn't mean that it still doesn't have glyphosate. I mean, it's getting up through through the whole plant. You know what I mean? The
dirty dozen has nothing to do with glyphosate. It's all about the insecticides and the fungicides, because they're not thinking that, oh, yeah, glyphosate's fine, it's harmless. So, corn is one of the clean 15, right? Corn.
Oh my God, that's horrible. I didn't even know.
GMO Roundup Ready corn.
I mean, we don't do any of that, but like, that's like unbelievable. Yeah. Because people will give you that argument though. I've had people say to me, oh, well, it's okay. I can just, if it's an orange, I'm peeling it off anyway, and I'm like,
yeah, can you wash it off? You can't wash off the glyphosate because it's in the tissues.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. It's in the tissues. 100%.
Yeah, you can't wash it off.
Honestly, if I can't buy something, a fruit or vegetable or whatever it is, and I can't get it organic, certified, I just don't bring it to the house anymore. And it's just,
we do that too.
Sometimes the kids wanted strawberries, and I went to the store, and I know that's not in season, but they're children. We promote a lot of seasonal diets here. But anyway, so they want strawberries, and I'm like, if I can't get it, certified organic, and it is more expensive, I'm not going to buy it though, because forget it, it's not good for them.
Too dangerous. right?
Yeah, my family's been, my husband and I have been buying only certified organic for over 10 years now. Really, as I started to learn about glyphosate, when I came back from that meeting, and after about 6 months, we just had a purge. We just like, okay, not organic, gone. We threw away everything in the kitchen.
Gotta have boundaries.
I've been kind of using up the cereal and then buying new organic, and they were like, no, we can't eat this stuff.
100%.
Not even worth it, right?
Yeah, all the spices, we just threw them away and started.
Yeah, even spices. People don't think
right.
about that, but like even your spices have to be certified organic. Yes. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's like it's sneaky. You know what I mean? You don't think about every little thing, and then of course tap water. Forget it. Like that's another whole topic of conversation.
I know that's tough that the water has become so toxic. It's
Now,
really sad.
if somebody doesn't have like a whole house filtered, system, can glyphosate get in through the skin?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So like even if you're showering in tap,
there's people, who I like this Dwayne Lee Johnson, who was the first lawsuit on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Do you know about the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
I've heard there's a major
San
connection.
Francisco. Yeah.
Yeah, that was so interesting. I can remember when he got awarded by the jury, got this huge award. I was in the pool and my husband was sitting inside of the pool. We were like totally hysterical. We couldn't believe it, because I didn't expect them to win, because they've got such hot shit lawyers and they just always win,
Yes.
And so, and after he won, there were several more. There's actually been a couple more recently. There's one in Philadelphia, one in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. People are getting awarded a huge amount by a jury trial. I think there's 5 of them. That's
key, probably, though, right, Dr. Seneff? The jury trial.
It is key. I think it is key, because the jury is willing to fight back. And then, of course, it goes through a process. The judge usually cuts it down to a lot less money, and then the Monsanto and it comes back with go to a higher court, and it goes on for years. I mean, it's just really sad. But they're in trouble now. They have like probably over 100,000 people waiting in the wings for their day in court. It's just completely out of control. And Bayer has decided. I heard Bayer's decided starting next year, I believe, to not sell Roundup to the general public. They're still going to use it on the food in America.
Oh, great.
Because they can't prove it with the farmers, because they're exposed to so many things. So the farmers don't win their lawsuits, because they'll say, oh, it's the other stuff you were exposed to that caused your problem. But with these lawsuits, it's always someone who's just using the Roundup on their own property. Or in the case of this Dwayne Lee Johnson, he was a school groundskeeper, and the only chemical he used was Roundup, and he used it on the school grounds, which of course upsets me, because that's the little kids, right? And he had his equipment was faulty, and it got sprayed on him by mistake. He got exposed on his skin. That's why it reminded me of that story, because that's how he got really toxic exposure, and he got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He had young children. It was just really sad. But I met him personally. He came here to Hawaii and testified, and then they actually banned glyphosate in the schoolyards as a consequence of his coming here. So I was
is that in all states?
In Hawaii, just in Hawaii.
Oh,
they don't allow glyphosate on the schoolyards. Yeah, all the states should ban it on the schoolyards. I mean, that's just like a no-brainer, right?
I don't think people realize how ubiquitous it is, because I have a local park. I would walk around this lagoon, and then they put a sign up, and they're saying this whole area of it's like a preserve, not a preserve, but there's lots of ducks and whatnot, will be sprayed with Roundup Ready or whatever it's called. And I'm like,
I know.
wow.
It's harmless, it's perfectly safe, and therefore you can use it everywhere on the playground, no problem. I mean, that just drives me nuts,
Drives me nuts too. Like even when I walk my dog, and I'll see like, they had that sign that you could tell that, don't step on the thing for 24 hours. Like that's enough, right? I'm like making sure the dog doesn't get on that grass and step on the, you know what I mean? It's like, it's terrible. And I've even heard that, I don't know what podcast it was. It wasn't one with you, but it was another one on glyphosate, and I can't remember who it was. And he was talking about how it's airborne in some places. So obviously it's in the rainwater, it's airborne. Like
I think it's coming out of the gasoline, out of the fuels from the diesel fuel and the gasoline. In the United States, we now require, I think, 10% ethanol in our gas. Ethanol is GMO Roundup Ready corn.
Yep.
And I'm pretty confident that you'd find glyphosate in the ethanol, and it'll evaporate before it reaches combustion. For example, even at the gas station, when you're pouring it in, you can smell the gas, right? It's evaporating. Yep. I did. My friend Anthony Samso was doing some studies on rainwater, and he has his friends collect rainwater samples, and I collected one here in Hawaii, one at my home in Massachusetts, and one at MIT where I work. And only the MIT sample came out positive for glyphosate, and that's in the city. It's in Cambridge. So in the city, the rain catches the glyphosate. It's a rain sample. It captures the glyphosate from the air, I think, because I think it's in the air from the gasoline, from the diesel fuel. The diesel fuel is also, they're really into fuel, replacing fossil fuels with fuels that are derived from crops. And they derive the diesel from, Europe has they have a lot of diesel cars, and they get a lot of their diesel from South America, from Argentina, where they have massive amounts of GMO Roundup Ready soy. That's a source of that diesel fuel.
So almost like mind-boggling, and then at a
It
certain
is.
point, I think people just go, it's overwhelming, right? And
Right.
It is. I
And
mean, you sort of get to the
lost
point where you
cause.
just want to crawl into a hole and die. It's like,
I
I
know.
can't face this world.
Yeah.
Go
I
live in
mean,
a cave somewhere instead and hope that,
I know.
you're free of it.
Isolate yourself from the world, but move to some island where nobody
I
lives.
think I want to move to Hawaii. You said yours
This
didn't
is pretty here. We're actually really happy to be here in Hawaii, North Shore of Kauai. It's a lot of organic farmers around
That's
us.
beautiful. I've been there. Yeah.
Really, really great.
Oh, that's on my bucket list to go to Hawaii. Amazing. Yeah.
Well, I'm just
So-
noticing the time, and ladies, and I don't want to leave out anything important about deuterium. If there was anything more you wanted to say as sort of in the
Well,
nutshell.
let me just add something about the melatonin, because I was going to get back to that, because melatonin is really, really interesting. It starts with the serotonin, which came from the tryptophan. The tryptophan is the sugarmate pathway, so glyphosate suppresses the source to make it, and then the serotonin is turned into melatonin by adding two things to it, an acetyl group and a methyl group. And both the acetyl and the methyl likely come from that hydrogen the hydrogen gas that the microbes made. By the way, you can see the pathways. They're provided. That methyl is coming from methionine, and the methionine has this. It comes from the methane, so it's very low deuterium. And the acetyl, the same thing. Like you have these acetate producing, acetogens, bacteria that make acetate. Acetate is basically a methyl with a carbon dioxide attached to it. So both the acetate and the methyl, the acetyl and the methyl, both of those are low in deuterium because they came from that hydrogen gas. And the body obsesses on keeping both of them. Acetyl coenzyme A is what you feed into the mitochondria to make energy. Acetyl coenzyme A, and that acetyl is going to be beautiful if it came from that pathway. It can come from other pathways too. So, but anyway, I think both the acetyl and the methyl that are added to the serotonin to make the melatonin are going to be low in deuterium. And that's what makes melatonin so special. And it's really interesting that I didn't know this until recently, but all the cells in your body make their own melatonin. We think the pineal gland, makes the melatonin, goes into circulation, which is true. And that helps you sleep and all of that. But actually all the cells make their own melatonin, and they make a lot, and they make it and they break it down. They make it and they break it down. And
I hear that the infrared helps your mitochondria make melatonin.
That's right. Yeah. And so, and that's all this, the physics of these circles, these molecules that have circles, where they can circulate the electrons around. It's really cool physics. But the melatonin that they're making and breaking is they're using it as a way to break down the methyls and the acetyls to get low deuterium supply to the mitochondria.
Nice.
So I think melatonin is incredibly important as a way to supply low deuterium nutrients to the mitochondria. And that's what keeps them healthy. And of course, we have mitochondrial dysfunction is associated with all kinds of diseases.
Every disorder. Every disorder, I think that it's associated with, and I'm so glad you talked about that with the melatonin, because I had learned, again, this is also from Carrie Bennett, Heather, that pineal melatonin is only 5% and mitochondrial melatonin is actually 95%. And the way that we make it, which you brought up, Heather, was being exposed to near infrared light, which is available from sunlight all day long. So I just wanted to point that out.
There you go. That's right. And that's why sunlight exposure is so much more important than vitamin D. People just say, your dermatologist will say, stay out of the sun and take that vitamin D supplements. No, don't listen to him,
Please
sunlight is so important and way beyond vitamin D.
Yeah, way beyond. I wanted to give some people some tips, so I don't want them to feel like it's doom and gloom and there's nothing we can do. And, before we end, because there are things that we can do. And I think it's our responsibility as the consumer to stop buying, these produces that are sprayed with glyphosate. That's one of our things we can do. If we don't buy that anymore, then if it's gonna rot on the shelves, then they're not gonna do that anymore, right? So I think it has to be coming from us. And like, you know, my family has switched completely to a 100% organic farm that we buy from, that is an Amish community that we, you know, get
That's
it.
really great. Yes.
Yeah. So like, I mean, you know, they're seasonal, so obviously we're not going to get strawberries, like I mentioned before, from them, but, you know, this time of year. So I do use the food store, of course, sometimes too. But like I said, like if we, you know, choose regenerative agriculture and we, you know, we make those choices, you know, I think that's going to drive, you know, it has to come from us, because it's not going to come from them, right? They say it's safe, so it has to come from us.
Yeah, I think
But
so. I feel like grassroots, bottom up, and just anybody who knows about this, tell your neighbors, tell your friends, tell your family, like get everybody on board with not only certified organic, but also whole foods, natural foods.
yes,
Throw away the processed foods. Don't buy the soy protein bar, you know?
right, because the deuterium content, let's just clarify that the deuterium content in a processed food is going to be way higher, you
Yep.
know, than anything else you can eat. So processed foods, seed oils, all of that, you know, keep that away. And also, and you know, I want to ask you one more question, Dr. Seneff, I'm sorry. Does I have also learned that sunlight can help to deplete deuterium as well. Is that true? Do you know
That
that?
is probably true. I'm almost certain that that would be true, because a lot of these enzymes that are able to select hydrogen over deuterium rely on sunlight to catalyze them. So I think that the light is going to help them to do their job properly.
Right. Okay.
Well, this ties into, there's a higher deuterium content in the fruits and vegetables near the
Yes.
equator, but the sun balances it all out. In the northern latitudes, the food is, first of all, we don't have high carb food, right? Because there's not enough sunlight in the winter to grow it. And
Mhm.
so you don't want to be eating high deuterium food
Yeah.
in the winter time, because you
And
don't
we
have
should
the
have
sunlight to,
said which foods are low in deuterium, which are the fats.
yeah,
And some of
fat.
yeah, and especially animal-based fats. And
Yes,
certainly
or like
butter.
your butter, your lard, your pastured
Yes,
lard, you know,
organic animal-based fats is probably the healthiest food that there is. And so
And what a crusade everyone is going on with this whole plant-based thing, which I just think.
I know it's driving me
Ah,
nuts.
I wonder how
Don't
much
eat- don't eat
deuterium is in a
anything.
Beyond Burger.
Oh, I know. Oh my God.
Probably
It's
a
got a
lot.
lot of glyphosate too.
And a lot of glyphosate. Oh
Yeah.
my
But also
goodness.
these superfoods, I'm thinking you guys from the South America or whatever they're from, like all that stuff is probably high in deuterium.
Oh yeah, well, because actually something with light and deuterium, and so I'm like I said, I'm not so scientific, but there is something with glucose and deuterium and light, and there's a connection there. So like I know like a banana is going to have more deuterium than say what's a fruit, a carrot,
Apple,
an apple, a carrot, right? There is a connection there. So yeah, makes
Yeah,
sense.
I'd like to know more about that. I suspect you're right, and I'd really like to take a look at the role of different frequencies of light in catalyzing the enzymes that are involved with depleting deuterium. I bet you there's something there, and I'd love to find time to figure that out. The literature on deuterium is very lean, so it's really hard to pull the story together. I'm working on very lean materials. It's hard. Nobody's studying it, you know, really mostly in actually Russia, Ukraine, and Hungary are the main places where they're onto deuterium, which is interesting.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
that is.
I would move to Russia, but there's not enough sunlight. You can add that to your next book, right? I can't wait for that. When you have this book about deuterium, I'll definitely get it. And then you can have this whole light component in, because I'd love to learn more, because it's just, it's enlightening, right? You know, so, you know,
light also triggers melanin synthesis, and melanin is probably a cousin of melatonin, you know. I mean, it comes also from that shickamate pathway.
Yeah.
It's
all from that pathway. That's that's incredible, you know?
Yeah.
Interesting. So let's just leave the listeners with some practical tips. We said, you know, make sure you're buying certified organic, you know, maybe don't drink tap water, mention get out in sunlight, you know, anything else you would add that I'm missing? Any practical?
Well, I'd say a high sulfur diet.
Yes, you mentioned that in your book, which I was like, oh, I'm going to eat my onions because I love onions and stuff like that.
Yeah, onions and garlic. Garlic is wonderful. We use a lot of garlic in our cooking, and of course, a lot of like eggs and seafood, really good sources of sulfur. And of course, the organ meats are very, very healthy in terms of the vitamins and minerals, but they're going to be very toxic. So you really can't eat liver unless you know it's organic, right? It probably looks so gross you wouldn't buy it.
That's a really good point for people who are like into that, you know, like you
Yeah.
want to make sure that you're eating if you're going to buy a liver, make sure it came from an animal that wasn't, you know, had a lot of toxins in it, because that's where they get stored.
Yeah,
You know,
it's too bad because they're really high nutrient dense foods I really like. And of course, organic eggs are fantastic, and they're not that expensive when you consider it, you know. They're expensive eggs, but they're not expensive. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Compared to what other people buy in, like I say, at Starbucks, right? I mean, it's not that
I
expensive.
know,
You
compared
know,
to a
like
cup of
it's
coffee
true.
from Starbucks. Yes,
Yeah.
right. So eggs are really great, and seafood,
Yeah.
all the oysters and clams and crab and all that. Also expensive, unfortunately, but
Well,
but
the most nourishing foods are the most expensive. It's really sad. Like all the
I know.
products,
That's
basically,
why
are
what
going up.
happens when people are poor and they can barely afford to buy food, they buy all that crap at
This
the,
is
all that
this is a
processed
major
food.
problem in our country as well, because the people who can't afford to do this, you know, are the people who, you know, they can't afford to be, you know, I can't only buy organic. They can't afford it. They can't afford the good water. And then, yeah, it's really sad.
Then they get, you know, really nasty diabetes, and they have a lot of health issues, and they have a big medical bill, you know.
Yeah,
It doesn't win. It doesn't win to eat bad food. It really doesn't.
You're better to pay the farmer than to have to pay the doctor.
Exactly.
And I, you know, as a former teacher, it's heartbreaking to me. And I taught special ed, which you probably, you don't know, Dr. Seneff. So I taught a lot of children with autism, and, you know, they are low income, usually a lot of times too, which maybe is contributing, you know, because they are not getting as good food quality. And it's like, some of these kids, the only meals they got were at the school. And then unfortunately what they're eating is bad food, but it's not good food. And that's the really sad thing too. Is really hard.
I think if you can pressure your school system into thinking about serving more wholesome foods, whole foods, organic foods, you know, I really wish that the government at the federal level would take on the responsibility of subsidizing the school lunches in order to provide healthy food to the kids. That would be so great. I mean, it would be such a simple thing to do to help improve the health of these children, you know.
Imagine what the outcome of that would be. You know what I mean? Like, it could be massive. So yeah. So those are all really great tips. I mean, I you know, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all your knowledge. Anything else you want to share with us?
I think we've covered a lot of good stuff. So I'm happy that we really got pretty deep into deuterium, and really the main message that I wanted to get across is there. So
yeah,
I hope people will be interested, and I hope people will try to learn more about deuterium, because it's really important.
Yeah,
I think it's crucial, and I think it is a big source of the problems with the autistic kids is this deuterium toxicity in the mitochondria.
Well, I'm really interested. So, you know, when you have that next book, I'll be on the list. So, yes, we appreciate you so much. You know, for coming on, and, you know, we'd love to, anytime you want to do a part 2, we'd love that too as well. So yes, yeah, amazing.
Great. All right.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Seneff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.